Senator Smith.
Thank you very much, Mr. Acting Deputy President. It was just over 2 years ago this month, on the 5th of March 2015, that I drew the attention of this chamber to a matter of increasing seriousness for many pastoralists across Western Australia, and one that should be of growing concern for everyone living across my great state. The issue, of course, was wild dogs and their propensity to attack livestock across Western Australia and, of course, to stock pastoral lease holders of viable source of income. 2 years later, wild dogs are continuing to cause havoc and heartache for many West Australian pastoralists, especially those located in the southern rangelands of Western Australia, as well as sheep farmers in the north-eastern wheat belt. Wild dog attacks are now estimated to cost the West Australian livestock industry around $8.7 million annually in lost production and management time, and are becoming both an economic and social drain on many regional communities, with more and more stations and farms forced to destock. 2 years ago, I mentioned the devastating impact that destocking had on the Dowden family, who live at and run Chalice Station in the Murchison part of Western Australia. Chalice Station has been in the Dowden family since 1888 and has run some of the largest flocks in the state, until Ashley and Debbie were forced to destock in 2008 because of wild dog attacks. As I mentioned, Ashley and Debbie's words back then, Ashley and Debbie were said to say, "We were mustering for shearing and putting them in holding paddocks and going in the next morning and they were dead, sheep everywhere from dog attacks. The goats disappeared, followed by the sheep, and they paid the bills. If we were lucky, there was a bit left over to put in the bank to cover the hard times. The pastoralists themselves were the next to go, and next, of course, will be the sustainability of the land, because no one will be left to manage it. The devastating flow-on effects from wild dog attacks is enormous. Many pastoralists, after being forced to destock, are faced with no choice but to sell their station at a loss and try to find work in an economy where regional jobs are scarce, to say the least, or, like the Dowdens, face the challenge of switching to cattle, which is a more costly exercise, especially when you do not have an income due to stock losses from wild dog attacks. With no sheep, there is no work for shearers, no work for wool pressers, no work for fencers, no work for caterers, no work for shed hands, many of whom are local Indigenous people. With work drying up, people move to other locations, destroying the viability of local businesses and sporting and services organisations, adding to the pressure of our regional towns across Western Australia. Unlike the other side of this chamber, I and my West Australian Liberal colleagues, particularly the member for Durack, Melissa Price, have, as many of my coalition colleagues in Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria have done, visited the stations and farms, listened to the farmers and pastoralists, like the Dowdens, whose lives have been so drastically affected by wild dog attacks. We've been active participants in baiting days, cutting the meat and preparing the baits, and most importantly, sitting with pastoralists and their families, listening to their concerns and pushing for action. Action like the completion of the Murchison Region Vermin Cell Fence, a 480-kilometre fence line that is needed to again make the wild dog problem manageable, and repairs to the state barrier fence. Action like funding for executive officers for regional biosecurity groups to coordinate wild dog control activities. Earlier this month, I was pleased to visit outside of Geraldton, almost 450 kilometres north of Perth, and join with the Minister for Regional Development, Senator Nash, to announce $2.5 million in federal funding to boost wild dog control management in that part of Western Australia. Consistent with Western Australia's Wild Dog Action Plan, another initiative funded in part by the Coalition Government, $1.5 million will provide much-needed support to landholders to increase their capacity to manage wild dogs by working more effectively with industry and community biosecurity groups. A further $1 million in competitive grants will go for regional wild dog fencing. While this announcement is a great outcome for regional Western Australia and for affected communities, especially across the mid-west of my state, it is also a positive sign of growing cooperation between state and federal governments on this important issue. There remain, of course, concerns from those from the front lines over how this funding will be best managed. But again, I commit to them that I'll be a champion for their local interest to make sure that that federal funding finds its way to their local issues. Murchison Regional Vermin Council Chairman and Yalgoo Shire President Neil Grinham, who runs Meeka Station, said in the Farm Weekly on the 10th of March that, he says, funding was always welcome, but it had to be put to good use and not to waste, as it had been in the past. Part of the problem, according to pastoralists like Neil Grinham, who has been fighting for state and federal funding for wild dog control since the mid-2000s, and whose shire is primarily comprised of 26 pastoral stations, all of which have been decimated by wild dogs, is that the Wild Dog State Action Plan, which provides a $20 million commitment to wild dog control, does not recognise the importance of ground projects like the Murchison Cell Fence. In the Farm Weekly, Neil goes on to say, this funding will be for trial cluster fencing. It will cost us and not be as effective as vermin fences, baiting and dogging programs, he said. He goes on to say, if I had a choice on what to do with the $2.5 million, I'd put the Murchison fence up. And if I had more money, we would break it into cells to control the outside. He goes on to say, we need to stop them, the wild dogs, moving south. We need to close the gap first. He goes on to say that it's like we're living in a boat with a very serious hole in it. Sentiments are again echoed by Murchison pastoralist Ashley Dowden, who said in the same article in the Farm Weekly, any funding to go towards dog control is good, but there are holes in the state plan. But as I see it, if we fail because there is no money for groundwork, no money to clean the dogs out. 2 years ago, I laid down the challenge to then WA Minister for Regional Development, Mr Terry Redman, to give this project his urgent attention and provide some hope and assistance in a part of WA where it's desperately needed, because this issue has gone on for too long and has now become the subject of bureaucratic pettiness. So today, 2 years later, I lay down the same challenge to the new Minister for Regional Development and Agriculture and Food, Alana McTiernan, to not ignore the plights of the pastoralists in the Murchison and to fund this fence. I challenge the new Labor government to put aside Labor's partisan approach to regional Western Australia and to not play politics with the livelihood of WA pastoralists, their families and their communities. Federal, state, Liberal or Labor, we all have an obligation to do more to assist in this critical fashion. The pastoral industry is and always has been the major source of economic wealth in the West Australian rangelands, creating jobs and empowering communities, while the small stock pastoral industry continues to decline, mostly due to wild dog attacks. It is not too late to save this important industry. As I've mentioned in numerous addresses in this chamber, the ability of our nation's regions to achieve their potential requires a government with the commitment and drive to turn talk into action. We are all living witness to how inaction and wild dogs has permitted the destruction of much of the small stock industry in Western Australia, an inaction that's caused by ignoring the pleas of landholders and giving preference to the self-interest of external stakeholders and departmental bureaucrats. Today I add my cause and my energy calling on Alana McTiernan and the new state Labor government in Western Australia to give their utmost attention and urgency to combating the plague that is wild dogs across the rangelands of Western Australia.